It's truly impressive to reflect on the fact that two of the most influential philosophers in history lived during the same era. We're talking about Seneca and Jesus, both born in the year 4 BC. Besides their overlapping lifetimes, their existences were almost parallel, despite being separated geographically, culturally, and in terms of social status. Interestingly, both were mentioned by Cornelius Tacitus, and Seneca's brother is briefly mentioned in the Bible. Fascinating, isn't it? At the end of their journeys, Seneca and Jesus Christ had similar tragic fates, both victims of imperial tyranny. However, their influences transcend their deaths. The Bible recounts that Jesus rose from the dead after 3 days, while Seneca did not meet the same end. Nevertheless, through their words, teachings, and writings, both remain as relevant to us today as they were to the people of their time. Another intriguing aspect is the similarity in some of their teachings. We'll delve into that as this video progresses, but for now, let's look at an example. Seneca said, "Why do you focus on the small faults of others while you are covered in a heap of defects?" Meanwhile, Jesus stated, "Why do you see the speck in your brother's eye but fail to notice the beam in your own eye?" Obviously, for Christians, it's impossible to equate Seneca with Jesus Christ, and it's not our intention to do so. Seneca was clearly a man with his imperfections and contradictions, while Jesus was both a man and the incarnate God. What we can affirm is that both lived extraordinary lives and left a legacy of teachings to be followed, considered, and questioned. In this video, we'll explore the similarities between Stoicism and Christianity. If you're new here, subscribe right now and stay updated with all our content. I invite you to watch this video more than once for a deeper understanding. The spread of Christianity and Stoicism have their intersections. Jesus' prophetic message was amplified by the Apostle Paul and his followers, who adapted Jesus' teachings for a more diverse audience. Paul, born a few years after Jesus, was a Pharisee Jew deeply immersed in the philosophical teachings of the time. Paul, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, a region that was also the birthplace of Stoic thinkers like Chrysippus and Athenodorus, was immersed in Stoicism while traveling across the Mediterranean to spread his message. The only concrete dates we have for key events in Paul's life and ministry are intrinsically linked to the Stoics. In the spring or early summer of AD 51, Seneca's brother Novatus, a high-ranking Roman official known by his adoptive name Gaius, took over the one-year governance of Achaia in southern Greece. One of these significant events took place in Athens, where Paul spent his days in the Agora, debating with Stoic philosophers. Paul became embroiled in a controversy with the Stoics, leading to accusations against his teaching about foreign deities. Some Athenians captured him and brought him to the Areopagus court, questioning him. "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." This passage can be found in the book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 19 and 20. In response, Paul articulated a series of truths, constructing a logical, persuasive, and compelling argument. His speech was interrupted when he mentioned the resurrection of the dead, causing division among the listeners. Some mocked, others wanted to hear more, but some, including Dionysius, a member and judge of the Areopagus court, and a woman named Damaris, joined him and believed in his words. In this memorable speech, known as the Mars Hill Discourse, Paul praised the religiosity of his listeners while criticizing the worship of unknown gods. He introduced the idea of a single creator, God, responsible for everything around us, holding power over heaven and earth, and giving all human beings life, breath, and all things. Paul emphasized that this God we seek is not far from each of us, as in him we live, move, and have our being, all being descendants of him. Today, a bronze plaque on Mars Hill celebrates this event, recording Paul's speech, by presenting the notion of a supreme creator, with whom we are intrinsically connected. Paul partially echoes the words of a Stoic philosopher's hymn to Zeus. His defense, incorporating elements of Stoic theology, converted Dionysius, a member of the court, and many others. Dionysius would become the first Christian bishop of Athens, now considered the city's patron saint and protector of the judiciary. Later, Paul traveled to Achaia, where Gaius, Seneca's brother, was the governor in AD 52. Just as Seneca was called from exile to be tutor to the young Nero, Paul was accused by the Jews and brought to trial. As described in the Bible, in Acts 18 verses 12 and 13, the Jews accused Paul of persuading men to worship God contrary to the law. However, Gaius rejected the accusations before Paul could even defend himself. In the following 7 years, Paul successfully expanded his churches across the empire, while Seneca transitioned from tutor to a right-hand man in Nero's administration. The compatibility between Stoicism and Christianity is debatable. When Nero became emperor at the age of 16, Seneca took on the role of advisor, writing speeches to persuade Rome that it was reasonable to grant nearly divine powers to a child. Over time, Nero proved to be disturbed and flawed. In AD 64, a great fire devastated Rome, destroying over 2/3 of the city. Details of this story will be explained in the second part of this video. However, considering that Nero, a student of Seneca and a Stoic, ordered the beheading of the Apostle Paul in the same year, one may question the compatibility between Stoicism and Christianity. Nevertheless, only isolated episodes of conflicts between Stoics and Christians can be observed in history. These events lead us to consider that they may have occurred due to the context of the time, marked by conflicts and power struggles. Kevin Rowe, a professor of New Testament at Duke University in the USA, mentions that Stoicism has long been an explicit and even intimate interlocutor for Christian thinkers and saints. In the 2nd century, the Christian author Tertullian referred to Seneca as "saepe noster," a Latin expression meaning "often ours." A century later, Jerome dropped the "saepe" and simply stated that Seneca was noster, or ours, in his work De Viris Illustribus. Furthermore, Augustine of Hippo, known as Saint Augustine by Catholics, also quotes Seneca in his work The City of God. Therefore, the relationship between Stoics and Christians runs deep. But the question arises, can a Stoic be a Christian? Can a Christian be a Stoic? The debate about this intersection persists to this day. Books have been written by scholars attempting to unite Stoicism and Christianity, just as others have been written trying to separate them. Most scholars seem to agree that it's challenging to be both a Stoic and a Christian simultaneously. However, one must remember that both Stoicism and Christianity have evolved over time and have multiple interpretations. In the end, one can appreciate the wisdom and teachings of both without necessarily adhering strictly to either philosophy or religion. The question remains, what lessons can we draw from the lives of Seneca and Jesus Christ? What did they teach us through their words and actions, and how can we apply their teachings to our lives today? These are the questions we'll explore in the upcoming parts of this video series. Stay tuned and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content.